Wow, what a wonderful reception. All right, I guess we can just jump right in. Um, the subject is bringing an end to discrimination. It feels like an overwhelming kind of enterprise, does it not? And so I'm just wondering from each one of you if you can talk about how you're leading that fight and what do you think is necessary in order to make the changes that are necessary?
Okay.
And let's start with you, Rashad.
Great. Well, thank you. It's great to be here. Hello, everyone. My organization, Color of Change, is infrastructure. And what we try to do is channel the voices, the passion, and the energy of black folks and allies of every race to hold government, corporations, and media accountable. And that's really how I'm going to answer this question, because I think what's incredibly important in this era where there's a lot of attention, and we can oftentimes see retweets, shout-outs from the stage, lots of conversations about race, that we can never mistake presence for power. Visibility, awareness, retweets, shout-outs from the stage, those things are important, but when we mistake presence for power, we can sometimes think we've done something that we haven't actually done. We can mistake, in the US, a black president for thinking we're post-racial. We can mistake the love and celebration for black celebrities as folks loving black people as much as they love black culture. And all around the world, black culture can be celebrated and monetized, and black people can be hated at the same time. And those two things don't have to be in conflict. And so when I think about the work to actually channel presence into power, it is about building the type of infrastructure that allows us to channel people's voices, to hold those in power accountable. And for us at Color of Change, our founding is very much part of that story in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, where black folks were literally on their roofs begging for the government to do something and left to die. And the thing about all of these moments, whether it was the summer of 2020, whether it was COVID, whether it's Katrina, whether it's so many of these issues, is they oftentimes illustrate things that we already knew. And so what we try to do is make sure that despite all of these issues that we already knew, that we recognize that if no one is nervous about disappointing black people, if no one is nervous about disappointing people of color, if no one is nervous about disappointing your community, then it doesn't matter. All the conversations, all the narratives, all the stories. And so I believe that fundamentally, if we are going to move these conversations forward, we need more people of all races invested. We need us organized collectively. And we need to remember that at the end of the day, we will always lose in the back rooms if the people are not lined up at the front door.
Very well said, well said. Kelly, just piggybacking on what Rashad said about power being the difference, not just presence. What does power mean to you? How does that show up? What does that look like?
That's a great question. So I am the CEO of Black Innovation Alliance. We are a national coalition of innovator support organizations that support startup founders, business owners, and creative technologists. There are currently 65 member organizations that are part of BIA, and they support about 300,000 entrepreneurs of color. And for us, we very much are about the power building work. We understand that in order to close a racial wealth gap that continues to grow and spread is going to require us to get really smart and really intentional about how we do that. So for us at BIA, it's really about creating the sort of ecosystem that is necessary for black innovators and entrepreneurs to thrive. There are a lot of programs that are spinning up all over the place in service to black entrepreneurs, but those programs are often not informed by any sort of real intel. Those programs are not effectively synced to other programs that enable entrepreneurs to be successful. There's very little connective tissue in the space. There's very little wayfinding, navigation, or line of sight, which leaves the experience of your typical innovator very fraught. So at BIA, we're trying to figure out how do we bring that connective tissue that really enables black innovators to thrive. Black women are the fastest growing demographic of entrepreneurs in the nation. People of color are onboarding into entrepreneurship at a rapid clip, often because they are being purged out of corporate America because the cultures are so toxic. And they say, I'd rather go it alone than have to deal with this. And so at BIA, it's about ensuring that that system is enabled to allow them to survive and thrive, and to be able to galvanize folks around this notion of Black innovation. It's almost like the X-Men, where Professor X puts the helmet on and he can see all of the X-Men out there in the world. That's essentially what we're trying to accomplish at Black Innovation Alliance. Like, how do we create some sort of resonant clarion call to the Black innovators across the country and across the diaspora, so that we can begin to build the sort of power that's necessary, so that when folks no longer care about DEI, when the window closes and we move on to the next thing, we've built the power base that enables us to be heard.
Yes, and well, very well said. Thank you so much. And yes, Dr. Sia Bulila. Is it? Yes. Talk about the work that you're doing in the fight to end discrimination.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, and gratitude to the audience for joining us in this discussion. I think it's of critical importance that we contextualize and problematize the issue of discrimination and racism. It is, of course, something that has existed for decades upon decades, and it's something that is very much endemic within our societies and within our countries. And I am of the view that if we are going to clearly address the scourge of discrimination and racism, we ought to be deliberate about it. We ought to be critical on how we address the problem. We have to be clearly identifying where the problem is. It is something that is systemic, and it is something that is institutionalized as we know it today. And one way in which we can address it, we need a multi-purpose and a multi-societal approach into dealing with the issue of racism and discrimination within our communities. We ought to be deliberate about it. You would understand that racism and discrimination as we know it, it's something that was instituted into law. We can also use law to address such a problem as discrimination. I find it so difficult that if in South Africa, discrimination and racism was instituted into apartheid law, and such law was used to oppress and suppress one group of people by another, what is it so difficult for our governments and our institutions to use law to bring about the redress that we need insofar as discrimination and insofar as racism within our communities? And when we speak of multi-societal and communal approaches in addressing racism and discrimination, I mean we need to build bridges between our communities. Black communities and white communities need to build bridges. They need to come together if they are to be deliberate and honest about addressing the scourge of racism. So in the organization that I work in, which is Journalists for Human Rights, we believe in a bottom-up approach in addressing issues that confront our communities. We engage with institutions and civil society organizations within the countries that we work in on how best to bring about the solution that to the problems that the people are confronting in their communities. It is only when we work with such communities, it is only when we work with organizations from the ground up that we'll be able to deliberate and clearly address the scourge of racism and the scourge of discrimination in our communities. So if it only comes from the government point of view, we'll never be able to address such a problem as discrimination and racism, which is so much deep-rooted within our communities. If it comes only from black communities, while we neglect the participation and the role of other members of our community, then we won't be able to clearly and seriously address and uproot such a scourge of racism and discrimination in our communities.
Well, just to dig in further on that point, both of you talked about needing to build bridges, needing to be between many different types of communities. Where and how have you seen that work I mean, have you seen, is it possible for us to kind of cut across all of these differences that we have to make, to make real change? And if you've seen a model of this, I'd love to hear more about that. So,
Well, you would remember that when the masses of black people in South Africa were marginalized and oppressed under the apartheid system, it took a collective will and power of the people from across the world coming together, speaking against such injustice, and mobilizing their resources and power to bring about an end to such an unjust, oppressive, and violent system as apartheid in South Africa. That was a moment in our history where, as a human family, we came together, regardless of our differences, the color of our skin, religion, and creed. We came together and deliberately identified apartheid as a crime against humanity, and we mobilized our forces. If you go to, during the civil rights movement in the United States, for instance, there were those who were calling for the release of Nelson Mandela and the liberation leaders who were arrested by the apartheid regime. If you look to different countries in Africa, there were those who were mobilizing and supporting through resources and through other means the fight against the injustice of apartheid in South Africa. That is the model that I think we can also use to uproot racism and discrimination as we know it today. For instance, in South Africa, we said, when we were free from apartheid, we said our freedom is not complete until the freedom of people of Palestine from the apartheid, from the Israeli apartheid state against the people of Palestine. We're basically saying, in the same way that the world was united against apartheid, the same world has to be united against apartheid in Israel. Our freedom is not complete. So that is that model that we need when the entire world come together and say, enough is enough.
Kelly, you wanted to add?
Sure. So I love James Baldwin. And he has this quote, and I know I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it's something like, there are so many things that we as human beings don't want to know about ourselves. And one of those things is that we are not terribly anxious to be equal, but we love the idea of being superior, right? And that's human nature. That's why discrimination looks different depending on where you are in the world. So in much of North America, definitely in the United States, it's really grounded in race. That is our social hierarchy. It is very fundamental to our American story. So that's what it looks like here. But there's a reason that it iterates as you go around the world, because it's a human problem. And it's something that we as a human race need to figure out, like, how do we circumvent aspects of our nature that cause us to want to be superior? That's why even within certain subgroups, we have our hierarchies, even within marginalized groups, right? So part of it is figuring out, like, what are the practices that really enable us to be mindful of the fact that we're always looking for ways to establish status, right? And that'll enable us to be a lot more strategic in how we go about addressing discrimination, however it looks. If you know that you're trying to short circuit someone, it's something that is really fundamental to a person's nature or a society's nature. For us in the United States, for whatever reason, it's very difficult for white folks to realize that racism is a thing. And every 30 years, there has to be some major catastrophe to remind white people that racism is a thing. If we could just all develop some level of racial literacy to say, let's all level up, because some folks are in kindergarten in terms of their level of racial literacy. If you ask your average white person, what is race? Why are you white? They probably couldn't even tell you why, because it's one of those things that is so quiet and we hide behind and we shuttle it under the rug that we don't even understand the nature of our primary social hierarchy in this country. So in a lot of ways, in these conversations around discrimination, we're finding phantoms and ghosts and manifestations of a very, very deeper societal rooted ill and disease that is also tethered to our human nature and our deep need to establish some elevated level of consciousness. And we could do that because it's the 21st century and we need to figure it out. But that's why our efforts often around discrimination don't win, because we don't ground it in what's real, which is that this is a much deeper societal ill, going back to your point, as well as a function of our broader human nature.
Rashad, what would you say to
Yeah.
that revelation?
I really appreciate this. And, you know, I think bridges can be a byproduct of work to build power. I think that it can be the thing that we get at the end, but I don't start off with the idea of trying to build bridges, because I actually don't believe that fundamentally that changes the dynamics of people's lived experiences. And, you know, we end up time and time again in these conversations. Do we have a national conversation, an international conversation about race? We need to come together and talk about race. And once again, I think this gets back into this frame of presence versus power. And when I talk about power, I mean the ability to change the rules. Sometimes those rules are the written rules of policy, and other times those are the unwritten rules of culture. But the ability to change the rules is what power is about. And anything short of a conversation about rule change is a conversation about presence, not about power. And I'm going to give you some examples. Think about every major corporation that has a DEI officer, and I am not here to come for any brother or sister in that role. I know people are going into the fight. But the DEI job in those corporations is basically the only job that can fail year over year. And nobody's bonuses are tied to it. The go-to-market strategy of the organization is not tied to it. The investors are not. Recently, we've been winning at shareholders meetings around racial equity audit, and I just presented at the McDonald's shareholders meeting, and we won with 54% of the vote. But that's going to get just a racial equity audit, which means they're just going to audit what the company is doing, not committing to actually changing anything after they do it. And so we can sometimes think things are happening that are not actually happening. And this is, I think, why we need to actually hold a really high standard for what does it mean to raise the floor and push up the ceiling. And that gets me to the way in which we talk about inequality and the stories that we tell. And far too often, we tell stories about inequality, whether it's about race, whether it's about gender, whether it's about sexuality or gender identity or anything else. We tell the stories of inequality that are stories of unfortunate rather than unjust. And what I mean is we tell stories that make it seem like inequality is sort of like a car accident. Like it kind of just happened, and it wasn't actually manufactured by a whole set of choices, by people who are profiting, by people who want to keep those things in place, by people who will absolutely, I believe, know that race exists, but will act obtuse. Because the whole idea of, for instance, white replacement theory means that, like, white people don't want to become the minority. And why would you not want to become the minority? Because you actually know how minorities are treated, right? Because if minorities did not actually get treated different, then what would be the problem with becoming a minority? But we are now in these conversations, right? And so I don't want people to act obtuse. Like, people actually know that racism exists, and we tell stories that are unfortunate rather than unjust because it allows people to move to charitable solutions rather than structural change. It allows people to actually give away a little bit of money here and there, but not actually change any rules around the way. And I'm going to end by saying this. It gets down to all the ways in which we tell stories. So think about just the framing of this. Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank, rather than banks are less likely to give loans to black people. Now, they may sound like the same thing, and they may actually draw on the same data points, right? That, like, black people are not getting loans at the same rate from these institutions. But when we say black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank, people say, what's wrong with black people? Maybe we should help them deal with institutions which have targeted, redlined, exploited, and excluded them from the very beginning. Because we need to help them do better inside of systems that were actually set up to exclude them. Now, if we say banks are less likely to give loans to black people, now we actually ask ourselves, what's wrong with the banks? Do the banks need structural change? Do we need to do things differently? So I think in all of our work, we need to be very clear and precise and not allow the folks in sort of who are in power to be able to set the terms of the debate, to both win because of the inequality, and then to decide how the inequality will be dismantled. And that gets me back to why we need more people invested of all races. And if that gets us down to bridge building, then by all means, yes. But I do not want to build a bridge to a place that I don't actually want to go. I want to be able to raise my community up and to be able to have the type of power that we actually deserve. And so when we talk about translating presence into power for our 7 million members at Color of Change, it means about translating that energy to hold government, corporations, and institutions accountable, to make demands and hold them accountable. And when they don't do the things that we need them to do, that we push. And when they do the things that we want them to do, that we hold them up and signal the right things along the way. And in that sort of way, we can do the type of work that raises the floor on what's acceptable. But in my opinion, what's most important is that we push up the ceiling on what's actually possible.
Push up the ceiling, absolutely. Well, how can we, all the people who are here in attendance, this is a tech conference, technology is critical to our, advancement in the world, obviously. How can we, in general, make our own difference, make our own impact? If you can each just give like one thing that you think would really help kind of flip the switch a bit, get us on the right path.
I am one that believes that each and every individual has a responsibility to contribute in the development and transformation of our communities. It doesn't matter what trade you are in. We all have a collective responsibility to contribute. I am an activist for peace and human rights. It is my responsibility to come in spaces like this and challenge the status quo. It is my responsibility to come in spaces like this and say the apartheid against the people of Israel, of Palestine, is an injustice, the same way the apartheid was injustice to black people in South Africa. It is my responsibility to inform our people in spaces like these. That is my responsibility. I'm not a tech or an innovation individual, but my responsibility as one that works with governments and as one that works with communities is to engage them honestly and critically. So we all have our own collective will and power to contribute in spaces that we're in the transformation and in the change that we want to see. Those that who are in the innovation and business sector, they have their own collective will and responsibility to devise strategies and tactics within the limited powers that they have and abilities that they have to design approaches that seeks to bring about the transformation and the change that we need in our communities. So that's the only way we can contribute. Each and every one of us has a collective will and power, and we all have resources and skills to invest in that change and in that transformation that is much necessary and needed in our communities. That is how we can contribute, from my point of view.
Wonderful. Kelly.
So I'm going to take it a little bit a different direction, because I think black folks in particular hold a lot of the responsibility of advancing this conversation. So I think we need to do less. I would love for us to do less because it's very taxing on black and brown folks, and it's real. So I would say for my white brothers and sisters who really want to do their part, like, just level up on your understanding. I had a conversation with someone who is an executive at a Fortune 500, and he said, the white male executives, they care, they're just afraid to have the conversation. I said, so your company is leading us into the frontier of all things, but you're afraid to have a conversation on race? I don't buy it, right? So that's a choice. If you as an executive decide not to have the conversation, it's not about fear, it's about you choosing not to prioritize it. And going back to Rashad's point about DEI, there are a lot of organizations and corporations that say they care, but there's no investment. there's no money. So I can't tell you how many conversations we have with corporations at Black Innovation Alliance, and they want to partner, and we're like, where is the budget? Do you have a budget? If you have no budget, we cannot partner. And so if you care about it, you will invest in it. For us at BIA, we are really concerned about supplier diversity, because when we talk about entrepreneurs growing a business, you need to access enterprise level opportunities and contracts. And supplier diversity hasn't seen any innovation in 40, 50 years. And so most corporations have 1.5 staff dedicated to supply diversity. They can't even have 2 full people dedicated to it. So that tells me how much you care about it. So if you are a corporation, you need to invest money into DEI, into inclusion, equitable strategies, if you really care about it, because otherwise, you know, it's just not real. It's just not real.
So in the summer of 2020, many people, and I'm from New York, so I might be very New York-centric here, but many people thought the best that could be done in terms of activism was clapping outside of windows or uplifting investigative journalism. And it was the murder of George Floyd on our screens when an unprecedented number of people were looking at screens because of quarantines and all sorts of restrictions that drove people into the streets, moved people into action. And I think about all those commitments from corporations, many of whom I woke up some mornings and they said they were making donations to Color of Change, and Color of Change does not take corporate financial support. So I was like, I don't know what Color of Change they're talking about, but I hope they respond to our last campaign demands, because that's the only conversation that I really want to have. I say that to say that, you know, when we think about racial justice, we shouldn't think about racial justice as charity. We should think about racial justice as strategy. And not just as strategy in terms of what is it going to take to get the most people engaged to rework the systems that are hurting us, but also the framework by which we can look at whether or not something is actually achieving the type of change that we want. And when I think about technology, to really get to your question about sort of the role of tech in our lives, and as an organization that was founded with a single email to 1,000 people in the aftermath of a crisis, we are a digital-first digital native organization that uses technology every single day. But the technology that is supposed to be bringing us into the future is dragging us into the past. And that is not an accident, it is a choice, because companies are choosing growth and profit over safety, integrity, and security, because the rules are set up to do that, and they will pay us lip service over and over again unless we change the rules. And so if I sound like a broken record, it is because I want us to be in the space of recognizing that if we want to achieve the type of justice that raises the floor for all of us, then we have to do the work to change the rules. Because the inequality that we are seeing is not an accident, it is a result of societal choices and societal rules. And only by changing those and investing in the communities most impacted will we actually drive ourselves towards the change that we all deserve, the change that will lift all of our boats, and the changes that will allow us to truly live in a multiracial democracy. Big tech will not do that without us forcing them to do it, but it is a chance, it is a thing that we can actually do, and I invite us all into that conversation.
I think that's a great way to end the conversation. Thank you so much to the 3 of you. Wonderful, wonderful insights.